Hi, I'm Joe Klein from. Oh. I'll wait until Dr. Sorensen finds his way. No, that's okay. I got all the time in the world for you, Ted. I think we all do. Joe Klein. Joe Klein from Time Magazine. I am the moderator. Today, the topic is probably one that is closest to the heart of this organization, of any that we deal with here, which is how the rest of the world sees us and thinks about us, and what the rest of the world thinks about. This session is on the record, but it's not on the record for your cell phones and Blackberries and all the rest of that, so turn those things off. We have a distinguished group, and the way this will proceed is I'm going to ask Andrew Kohut, the director of the Pew Research Center, to talk about this study which he's been doing for the last 5 or 6 years about global views of the United States. And then I'm going to turn to our two interlocutors, Mike Gerson, over here to my right, who was George W. Bush's chief speechwriter, and Jamie Rubin, who was the spokesman for the State Department during the Albright era. And with that, we got a lot of territory to cover. Oh, after they speak and I ask a couple of moderator questions, it's going to be open to you, obviously, and we'll try and get to that point as quickly as possible. So take it away, Andy.
Okay, thank you. I'm here to set the stage for the discussion, to talk about what we've learned about the image of the United States over the past 5 years. We've done a survey each year. In total, we've interviewed 165,000 people. These were in-depth interviews. They weren't 10-minute interviews. They were half-hour, in some cases 1-hour interviews. We've been in 54 different countries. And as a consequence, I think we've been the principal chroniclers of the rise of anti-Americanism in this decade. Let me give you the leads from the various reports. In 2002, we interviewed in 43 countries. And our lead was that the image of the United States was slipping all around the world, but there was still a reserve of goodwill toward the U.S. Well, the idea of the United States image slipping all around the world just less than a year after the 9/11 attacks, because the interviewing was done that summer, made big news. But the worst news really came in the next survey, the survey we did in the spring of 2003. The headline was very different. It said that the image of the United States had plummeted all around the world. This was, of course, after the war in Iraq, and the fat was in the fire, so to speak. The next survey was done in 2004. In March of 2004, things were going pretty well in Iraq. A little while earlier, we had captured Saddam Hussein. There wasn't really a full-blown insurgency. But we didn't see a recovery of the image of the United States, certainly not in the Muslim world, certainly not in Europe. In fact, the image of the United States was a little bit worse in Europe in 2004. By 2005, we did see a bit of improvement in some countries. American response to the tsunami aid was well appreciated in Indonesia, India, and other places. But by and large, we began to talk about the way anti-Americanism had become entrenched. And that was a word we used an awful lot in 2005. Similarly, in 2006, we didn't see much movement. If anything, we saw a little bit of slippage in the polls. This year in 2007, and I'll talk a little bit about the 2007 survey, but I want to give you the course of what we've learned in these many surveys about the image of the United States. But in any event, in 2007, we went broader. This is the biggest survey that we've ever done. We did 47 nations. And our headline was that the image of the United States, discontent with America, anti-Americanism, had deepened in the places or in the countries where it was existent, but it really hadn't widened. As to the deepening, the image of the United States is very, very bad in the Muslim world. I think the most extraordinary example of it is in Turkey. Back in 2002, 55% of the Turks had a favorable view of the United States. In 2006, that fell to 12%. I said, my gosh, that's not going anywhere. Well, this year it fell to 9%. In Western Europe and among our traditional allies, we saw a similar pattern. In Germany, the favorability rating for America in 2002 was 78%. It was down to 30%. And Germany wasn't the worst in Europe. In Spain, it's in the 20s. Clearly, in the places where the image of the United States had begun to decline, those declines have continued, and as I said, they had become more entrenched. But the surprise in the survey this year was the extent to which the image of the U.S. hadn't really deteriorated that much, or if at all, in Africa. In the 10 nations in Africa, the U.S. Favorable ratings were very, very positive. We also found positive ratings for the U.S. among the republics of our big trading partners, India, South Korea, Japan. So it wasn't all bad news. We saw some signs that there were places where the image of the United States was actually still quite strong. But on balance, in 25 of 33 countries over this period of time, U.S. ratings were down. In some places, they were very, very, very far down. I'd like to tell you a little bit about what we've learned about the nature of this anti-Americanism. First of all, it's quite intense, and that's different. It's more intense than it was in the 1980s when America's policies were disapproved of. Reagan's get tough policies, and some of these surveys, we and other polls have found our allies saying that we represent as great a threat to peace as North Korea and Iran. President Bush took exception to that finding last year. It is really pretty hard to hear Europeans saying that about the United States. The other thing is that the image of the American people have been hurt somewhat. Americans are not hated in Europe, but the views of the American people are certainly less favorable than they once were, and there's been some consequence on the image of the American people, a very mixed image. Certainly in the Middle East, the American people are disliked, strongly disliked, if not hated in many places, not all places, not Turkey, for example, where the general view of the United States is so negative. As to the causes of all this, I mean, what we've learned over the years is not going to shock you in some respects. In the Muslim world, the view that the United States is unfair in the way it deals with Israel and Palestine is the 800-pound gorilla, closely followed by our presence in Iraq. The war in Iraq, the war on terrorism has never been seen as legitimate. It's seen as the United States picking on unfriendly Muslim countries. The war in Iraq is certainly, our presence in Iraq has certainly worsened all of this. The anger is perversive too. The views that people hold about, the positive views that we see about, that people hold about Islam, Osama bin Laden, these countries which have been declining, but nonetheless are incredibly high, as much reflect the fact that he stuck his finger in the eye of the United States, and more reflect that than an affinity for what he believes in. So Islam is, and Muslim countries rather, are really a different kettle of fish. As to the rest of the world where the United States is not liked, the big factors are a perception that we act unilaterally, we do what we want, we don't wait for our allies' the assent of our allies. We don't look for international approval. The war in Iraq is the poster child for that, and the policies of the Bush administration are seen as unilateral, and that's the biggest general charge that's correlated with anti-Americanism. Secondly, the U.S. does too little to deal with global problems, a view that's been prevalent in the first survey that we conducted, certainly prevalent in the views of people in the surveys that we did most recently. A third factor is that U.S. policies add to the gap between rich nations and poor nations, a view that even many Americans subscribe to. Also, that the United States is insincere. One of the most interesting questions in the poll that we asked this year, in 47 of 47 countries, we found the majority of people saying the United States promotes democracy when it feels it serves its interest, not wherever it can. Discontent with American policies have brought to the fore concern about American power. Throughout the 1990s, America had unrivaled power, but there was not the concern that we have about American power. The suspicion and resentment of American power. People in Europe in particular, but in all parts of the world where we're not well regarded, think the United States wants to run the world, doesn't want to pay attention to the views of other people. And it's not just policies now. Going forward, it's a matter of regaining trust with respect to, given the fact that we are so powerful. Much has been made about the values gap between Americans and Europeans, and it's real. Americans have a different set of values about government, about the social safety net, about environmentalism, about the use of military force. All of those things are very, 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 very apparent, but they are no more apparent than they were in 1990 when the United States was very well regarded. We think differently than the publics of our allies. Values are not the central issue. I'm going to wrap it up by saying what the latest poll found was broad discontent with the cornerstones of U.S. foreign policy. Not only are there worldwide calls for withdrawal from Iraq, but the publics of many, if not most, of our allies in Afghanistan, near majorities are calling for withdrawal from troops from Afghanistan, and France, Germany, Canada. Majorities want out. Only in Britain did we see continued support for presence in Afghanistan. Global support for the U.S. war on terror ebbs ever lower. The first survey that we did in 2002, the spring of 2002, found broad support for the war on terrorism. Those numbers go lower and lower. And then finally, in this survey, we found that the United States is increasingly blamed for the problem that's emerging worldwide as the most important problem facing the planet, and that is environmental problems. The United States is seen as a problem, not a solution, with respect to environmental issues. And Joe, I'm going to leave it there so others
Okay. To my mind, the weirdest little statistic that I saw in this is that of Israelis, a plurality, 42%, believe that the United States policy toward Israel is too pro-Israeli. I saw that. Let me ask you about. Let me ask you a couple of quick questions together. Today, in the Washington Post, there was an op-ed by Karen Hughes, the Assistant Secretary in charge of Public Diplomacy. Undersecretary. All that title for those so little success. But she mentioned a series of recent polls in which Osama bin Laden's ratings were declining precipitously in parts of the Islamic world. Is there anything in your study that relates to that or confirms it in any way?
Yeah, we've seen not only recently but steadily over the past 5 years declining support for terrorism in the Muslim world. It mostly starts in countries where they've had some experience with it. Indonesia, Morocco, the classic case is in Jordan. In Jordan, before the Amman wedding bombings, 55% of the people said that they thought that suicide bombing that targeted civilians in defense of Islam was justifiable. It fell to 25% the next year. With those numbers go reactions to Osama bin Laden. So what she said was right.
And the other thing I'll ask you quickly is one area that you didn't cover that I found very interesting is that the world's opinion of China is getting worse as well. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, part of the headline this year was that there was really discontent with all the powers that be, including China. The image of China has declined around the world over the past 4 years. There's great concern about its growing military power and much worry about its increased economic power, particularly in the nation, among the publics of other advanced nations who worry about the impact of China on their economies. In Asia and Latin America, China is seen as having a real presence, the same kind of presence that the United States has. And even though the image of the United States is positive in Africa, the image of China is at least as positive in many cases and more positive in other cases.
Okay, let me turn to Mike. I should have mentioned before that Mike is a fellow at the council now and also an op-ed columnist for the Washington Post. And Mike was one of the people who was most responsible for the Bush administration's policy in Africa, which resulted in the very best ratings that the United States received in any part of the world. So I'm going to ask you to respond in general to this, to the study, but also I want to ask you, how can we get it so right in Africa and so wrong in the Middle East?
Well,
and what was it about Africa that we did get right? And can it be extrapolated?
I thought it was one of the most hopeful things about the study, in where there wasn't too much hope, was that it is possible. I mean, America has always been popular in sub-Saharan Africa. It's not particularly new, but this is a circumstance where, to put it this way, I think that the Bush doctrine was fully orbed in Africa, which is opposition to terror, which is true in Somalia and other places, but also a sincere commitment to the provision of alternatives, and tripling of overseas development assistance to Africa, moving towards 2 million people on AIDS drugs. In my experience in traveling during the Bush administration, it is one of the few places where I saw spontaneous outbursts of pro-Bush sentiment. And it's pretty extraordinary. The reality there is I watched a decision made in the Oval Office in 2002 to pursue the largest program to fight a single disease in human history. That was unprecedented, and it's made a big impact. The fact of the matter is, people all over Africa know the phrase PEPFAR, which is not known in America. So for me,
tell us what it is.
Yeah, it's the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, and also the President's Malaria Initiative, which is well known over there. And so I think as it was developed in its best form, the Bush doctrine included opposing threats as they arise, also promoting democratic transitions, but also promoting development, fighting disease as an ideological alternative. And I think that's been more successful in Africa because the commitment has been greater.
If you were advising the president at this point on all of the rest of it, on how badly we're perceived in the world, and especially the perception that we behave unilaterally and as a bully, what do you think the president can do about that?
Well,
what do you think he should do?
Obviously, I think it's a genuine problem, but I think it's in a certain way belied by the reality of diplomacy right now. If you look at Iran, if you look at North Korea, if you look at other efforts as far as cooperation in the war on terror, they're actually quite multilateral. They're taking, I think, a fairly successful and effective approach. So one response would be that the reality is better than the poll. That America is cooperating, I think, strongly and effectively on a variety of global challenges. I saw that from the perspective of the Sudan, which was a model of multilateralism. That's not always a good thing, because there hasn't been the kind of level of urgency in the international community that I'd like to see. But the reality is that we worked with the AU, and we worked with the Arab League, and we worked with the United Nations. And it was, there were frustrations to that, but there was also been a significant amount of progress as far as a new peacekeeping force. I guess that's one response, is that there is I think the reality is better than the poll. I also think that there are bad reasons to be unpopular, like Guantanamo, which I think is a problem that needs to be solved. I think another bad reason to be unpopular is not being more aggressive on carbon, which I think we should be. But of course, then there are also good reasons to be unpopular. For example, I mean, the polling indicates that one reason that America is unpopular in the world is because a significant amount of the world wants Israel on the bottom of the Mediterranean. That's not an option for American policy. A significant amount of the world wants the United States to essentially abandon our ally in Afghanistan, which would be a disastrous policy. And I would say even in Iraq that I'm not sure that if America took the advice of the world that we would gain credit from the world in a situation where we would look weak and failed in that circumstance. Those are few.
Okay, let me ask Jamie. First of all, you've been living in Europe for the last 5 years?
7.
7. Time flies when you're getting old, right? The anti-Americanism there, according to the poll, is just it continues to deepen. And question is, in your mind, how much of this will just evaporate the moment that George Bush is no longer president, and how much of it is something else, and how do you evaluate it?
I think a lot of it, and I think everyone would agree that whoever the new president is, Democrat or Republican, there's going to be an effort, certainly on the part of governments, to give him a second chance, and elites as well. Whether people do, I think we'll have to see. One of the problems is that in the first term there was this sense, we're not really anti-American, we're anti-Bush administration. Then the American people reelected George Bush, and they couldn't say that anymore because they were now had to accept that the American people, by majority vote, supported the president's policies, at least compared to the alternative. And so that deepened it dramatically. And I think that was at the point at which, for many in Western Europe, the United States, perceptions of the United States changed perhaps for a generation, and at the younger people level, at the level of culture, and a lot of the things that I watched changed. I was there on September 11th in London. I watched people's reaction, and I mentioned this to all of us in the anteroom. For me, something went wrong very early on in the Guantanamo episode that Michael refers to, which is I watched everyone has their way of figuring out public opinion, and I went to my usual newsstand, and in early January 2002 I saw the papers from far left, and there are plenty of those in Britain, to far right, and there are plenty of those too, changed about Guantanamo and prisoners. There were two events that happened simultaneously: the picture of the detainee in the jumpsuit and the chains as one thing, but the next day there was the quote from the former Secretary of Defense, "I don't care how they're treated, look what they did to us on September 11th." And even the right in Britain found that offensive. And I think that's when the European, there are very legalistic societies, and we're not as legalistic, at least in their minds, when it comes to international law. And I think that is not easily changeable. Now, there are things that are changeable, and I think Mike did it exactly right. You've got to decide. We did this in the Clinton administration when Gingrich took over the Congress. We decided what were the things we could compromise on, what were the hell no's, and what were the things that we could really change policies about. And I think that's what the next president's going to have to do, is pick things that policy changes can make a difference, things that you're going to have to perhaps negotiate more diplomatically, and things that are in the hell no category. But the last point, and I think we can have a debate over which should be in what grouping, but I think at least on this panel it seems that everybody would agree that Guantanamo would be one. But more importantly, I would think it's very important to say, why does this matter? This isn't a popularity contest. We don't want to be liked for its own sake. And I think that's where people haven't quite understood the significance of this. And everyone has their own way of describing the significance of it. But mine would be when I served in government and the President or the Secretary of State was about to arrive in a European state or a modern moderate Arab country or a moderate, newly democratic country. We found that our interlocutor had an interest in making an agreement with us, a democratic interest, that their people would give them benefits if the next day's newspaper said country X just made an agreement with the United States. That gave us leverage in negotiations because they wanted that headline.
It's interesting.
I don't think they want that headline anymore.
Or they haven't been aware of it. Let me ask you one last quick question, then we'll turn it open to everyone. To me, I think, so much of this is about public diplomacy, and to me, the very bottom of the Bush administration, the moment in Iraq, came when Jerry Bremer decided to design his own Iraqi flag that kind of looked like the Israeli flag. And to me, that symbolized how little the administration knew about Iraq going in. But a good part of this, you presided over in your administration, at the behest of Jesse Helms, the demise of the U.S. Information Agency. Do you think that that was a mistake? You
told me you were going to give me softball.
Well, I gave him a little bit of time. Listen,
People can re-examine the USIA merger for a lot of different reasons. It was a calculation made at the time where other things were important, like the Chemical Weapons Convention that was stuck in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Many ambassadors, I believe, including some very dear to this organization, were being held up by Senator Helms. And this was a grand political calculation. I could argue that the issue was not that USIA was folded into the State Department. The issue was that the funding for those programs was eliminated. Whether it was called the USIA or whether it was folded into the State Department, there was no funding for these programs. No attention was given to them. But, people say that, and I would tell you that when President Clinton traveled around, there were more than spontaneous outbursts of support for the President of the United States. I remember one time even in Gaza, there were spontaneous outbursts of support for the United States, after coming from Israel, where there were massive outbursts of support for the United States. So you don't necessarily need a USIA banner on your public diplomacy programs to have good public diplomacy. A lot of it depends on how the principals speak. The biggest damage done to the United States, in my opinion, was allowing Donald Rumsfeld on TV so that the rest of the world could listen to him talk about them. And that's bad public diplomacy, with or without USIA.
Andy has a quick comment, and Mike, if you want to come back on Rumsfeld, and then get ready.
Well, I've spent 5 years listening to people asking questions about, well, does this really matter? And the thing to keep in mind about why this really matters is that public opinion is a player in foreign policy in much of the world in ways that it wasn't generations ago. The German election in 2003, anti-Americanism played a crucial role in the outcome of that election. The Spanish election in 2004, the fact that we could not use Turkey as a base for launching troops into Iraq was reflected broad public opposition to the very idea. The United States does have allied relationships and is working cooperatively with its allies and others, but working cooperatively is easier when you're trusted and liked than when you're not, and we are not trusted in many places, and we're not liked in many places, and those are real burdens for the country.
Mike, quickly.
Yeah, I wanted to agree, first of all, that to some extent the public diplomacy of deeds matters more than organizational detail. That was my experience. If I were an advocate of Egyptian democracy right now, I wouldn't think America was particularly consistent in the way that it approached these things, the way that Ayman Noor has been treated, the American reaction to these issues. So sometimes, on that issue, sometimes the accusation is that America is somehow extreme on the democracy agenda, when in fact in significant portions of the world it's viewed as inconsistent on the democracy agenda. And that itself is its own problem. But that said, in my experience in government, the American public diplomacy efforts and democracy efforts were deeply disorganized, very poorly directed. Karen has made some progress on the rapid response side, on the education and exchange side, but we asked for a review of democracy programs. We found literally thousands of programs in several different departments of government. Most of the programs had nothing to do with democracy at all. They were just essentially in that, put in that fiscal category.
Democracy or public diplomacy?
Well, actually, I'm talking about both, but we looked specifically at democracy promotion programs, and it was a total mess. I assume that it's a similar kind of, a divided effort between USAID and DOD, which takes a lot of these efforts and other things. So I think there's actually work to be done there, institutional work, to try to get a more directed sort of effort.
I'll say. Okay, questions back there. And let's make them questions and not speeches or rants.
In that case,
the decorous audience.
Tom Schick, American Express Company.
Hey, Tom.
Hi. Clearly, a lot of people in the world, particularly in the Muslim world, don't like the purposes or what they would probably call the ideology behind American policy. My question is, and I direct it to Mr. Kohut in the first instance, and the rest can jump in if you find it attractive. To what extent is the ineffectiveness of the policy a factor? America has always been seen as a can-do nation. For the past 7 years, there have been a string of screw-ups, if you will, to put it inelegantly, beginning with the way the 2000 election was handled. Obviously, Iraq is first and foremost the best example of that. The response to Katrina. America now has an image, I would think, of being a can't-do nation. To what extent is that an issue independent of the popularity of the policy?
Well, I think that a good deal of anti-Americanism is about not agreeing with our policies and not agreeing with our approach. Having said that, though, if the United States had been more successful in Iraq, if that proved to be a quick mission that got rid of Saddam Hussein, got American troops out, the country was reasonably stable, the United States would have the image of the United States the views of the United States would have been enhanced. This isn't the only issue, but like American politics, you've got ideology and you've got performance, and you can never ignore judgments about how good a job the player, whether it's a government or a political leader, does in dealing with the issues that it tries to confront. So performance is an issue. It's not the only issue, but it's a contributing factor. I don't think the view that the United States, certainly it's a very important political view here, and can't do with regard to Katrina and with regard to Iraq. It's more important. But the general notion of the United States as not capable I don't think that generically is a big deal, because the concern about us is not what we can't do. It's a concern about our power and how we potentially misuse it.
Yes, over here. You should also identify yourself and where you're from.
Yes, my name is Khalid Azim. I'm with UBS. My question is, America still remains a destination for scores of immigrants from the Arab and Muslim world also, and still look to the U.S. as their preferred destination to immigrate to. How do you put that into context with the analysis you've done on the popularity of the U.S.?
Well, 2 years ago we asked questions about where people wanted to go, and while a lot of people do come to the United States from these countries, when you ask them what are their first choice, it's not often the United States. It's Australia, or it's New Zealand, or it's Canada, or any one of a number of places. And you also have to take into account the kinds of people who come here, and then the kinds of people who don't come here and go someplace else. So I think there are some consequences for who we attract and how much interest there is in coming here as a consequence of how we're.
Can you tell us about what sort of people choose not to come here, and what?
Well,
what people do?
well, Joe, if you think about the major issues of immigration, the people who are coming here are poor people who are coming here for jobs. The issue is, are we attracting the educated classes and the skilled people who will enhance the United States?
But do they actually want to go someplace else, or are they?
Well, I'm telling you about the basis of this public opinion survey, which showed, on average, people in many parts of the world where traditionally emigres came from, saying they want to go elsewhere.
Just one small addition to that. I still believe there is this basic hypocrisy in the people wearing an Osama bin Laden T-shirt and then wanting to go visit their friends in the United States. But, and this may be a little bit of a commercial from the city I'm leaving, in the high finance area in London, there has been a shift in the last several years of wealthy Arab people not wanting to be submitted to the kind of treatment they feel they get at the borders, and that applies to high-tech, high net worth people. That's one of the reasons the hedge fund industry is largely based there, in addition to the legislation here of Sarbanes-Oxley and other factors. But there is, I think, some shift in the, let's call them the rich from the moderate Islamic world, who used to come to New York and don't come here as much because of post 9/11 realities.
That's been one of Secretary Rice's consistent concerns about visas and harassment and a lot of other things. I guess the only thing I would add just at the end is that poor people from abroad also make contributions to the United States.
Quite a few. Ted Sorensen. We're going to test the speechwriter, the bond of presidential speechwriters here.
I'm Ted Sorensen at Paul Weiss. No, I respect Michael Gerson. He's probably the best presidential speechwriter in this room. When you consider what he had to work with. In any event, my question is for
This is
Andy.
the kind of thing that goes on all the time when you guys have those speechwriter
Right,
dinners.
the special meeting. Yeah.
My question is for Andy, who is superb as always, and to dig into a little bit into this question of the intensity of the negative image. Michael and his comments kept brushing off unpopularity. I don't care much about unpopularity. Envy can lead to unpopularity. But a lot of people I'm in touch with around the world go much, much deeper in their dislike of the United States. They go, they are at a stage of contempt, and I think that's dangerous to our national security. And I might add, it's contempt by Africans for the much touted AIDS program, because it prohibits the use of American funds on condoms, and as a result, tens of thousands, if not millions, of Africans have died. So they have contempt for the hypocrisy of claiming we're doing a lot for AIDS.
Well, I think there's little question that there's a deepness to the negative views that we find in the surveys about the image of the United States. Certainly one of the things that comes through to us is how much the images of Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo, the pictures, are shaping the opinions of young people all around the world, just the way the pictures of America in World War II and the Berlin airlift and all of those things shaped the views of other generations of young people. You know, we've asked questions about how much attention have you paid to these things, and it's almost universal attention. People are aware of them and said they've seen them. Much more attention, by the way, than here in the United States. So I think maybe it's less shocking, if you think about that, to see that America is equated in Germany and Spain and France with the policies of North Korea and Iran, which is just unbelievable. It was unbelievable the first time I heard it back in 2003 in surveys that Gallup had done in every major, or that the EU had done in every major country of the European Union. But I agree with you, it's very strongly held. It's not like the 1980s when there was discontent with Reagan's tough position, but it didn't spread so widely and so deeply.
Yes, the woman in the back there. Could you speak up or speak up into a microphone?
Michaela Walsh. I'd like to know whether or not you keep any kind of a record of the way or the people that you interviewed, not just country by country, but women, youth, government agents, citizens, poor, rich, and then also Americans living outside of this country.
We don't survey Americans living outside of this country. I've been asked about that many, many times, but they represent such a small percentage of people out, a small number of people. You know, these attitudes are very robust. They're apparent in all sectors of society, of these societies. Certainly what we've seen, and one of the troubling things, is that there is pretty strong anti-Americanism among young people in the nations of our allies. And one of the things that I've always been struck by was that there wasn't a more positive view of the people, older people who remembered the United States during World War II and during the Cold War. So we are judged more critically by young people who are growing up on this terrible stuff about us, or these images of us and things being written about us. But there isn't a long memory with respect to the image of the United States. There's not much of a gender gap in views about the U.S. That's about what I can say about it, off the top of my head.
Gentleman in the front row, looks like a term member.
No, not yet. My name's Lane Green from The Economist magazine.
Ooh.
There boo for that? My question
Came from
is...
Jamie.
For 2000? My question is for Mr. Gerson, actually, and so, Jamie, you might not want to boo. I feel like probably everybody in this room is not just dismayed, but maybe even a little angry that the most admired country in the world for so long is now so disliked by so many people, and especially the young. You mentioned the young. Well, what do the young know? On the other hand, they're the future. The people that remember the Berlin airlifter dying, the people that remember Al-Qaeda, who are wearing those Osama T-shirts, they're the future. But my question for Michael is, what mistakes do you think might have been made in the message making of the Bush administration? Not just policy mistakes. I admire your honesty in mentioning carbon and mentioning Guantanamo, but in the message making itself, what do you think might have been done differently?
You know, to some extent, it's a difficult question because to go back to the point I was making earlier, I found at so many of these stages that objective circumstances determined public opinion, when the argument was that somehow if we would give this speech or say these words or have this formulation, it would solve the problem. That's often the input I would get from people, conservatives, that believed that we were more forthright about the ideological struggle, or others from a different camp that felt like we should be less forthright about the use of words good or evil or other things. And I'm sure that there could have been adjustments in some of those things. But you know, my worst day at the White House in many ways was the day of Abu Ghraib. That is, I remember a good friend at the White House walking out of the senior staff meeting who was very strongly for the democracy agenda and saying, it's undone everything we did. And, you know, so I do think that in many ways these pictures and practices and policies and failures, the initial stages of the Iraq War, the problems that related to prisoner detention, were the kind of ruling narrative in many ways. If you talk with Karen, who I have about these things, there was a period when she would attempt to go out to audiences around the world and make a variety of points about America's goodness and Americans' policies and our development assistance and other things. And these topics were the only topic of discussion. And that's, I think it's the reality. I'm a speechwriter by background. I believe in the power of rhetoric and words. But I guess one of the lessons that I brought out of the White House was, if things are decaying in Iraq, the words don't matter that much. If there are, images of abuse and lawlessness, the words, which I think were careful and well constructed and serious, don't matter as much. And so I guess that's kind of one of my takeaways from government.
So let me use the moderator's prerogative at this point. Do you think that the Abu Ghraib situation might have been mitigated somewhat if high-ranking resignations had been called for by the president rather than just the legal processes against people at the very bottom of the ladder? Do you think that the president should have demanded Donald Rumsfeld's resignation
I will tell you,
or accepted it when he offered it?
I will tell you that I believe that the responses on that in that matter and on Guantanamo ended up being procedural rather than imaginative international leadership. I think that's a fact.
Yes, women in the orange.
Veronica Krasheninnikova, Council for Trade and Economic Cooperation, United States, Russia. So as a Russian, I have ample opportunities to observe the opinions of my compatriots about the United States. And I would like to mention that together with the complaint about unilateral action of America in the field of foreign policy, Russians are particularly offended by America's pretense to be the world consciousness and the moral judge in this situation. And I think in Russia's case, the notion of democracy has taken a major blow in these past years, and I think it is connected to unfortunately, to the foreign policy of the United States. And in this case, this developing democracy is
question, because we're getting down to
is damaged. You mentioned that in the past few years, the results in the study went in a negative direction, and also the position of Undersecretary or Assistant Secretary for Public Diplomacy was created the same number of years ago. Would you see a correlation between these two events? And maybe
I should mention that Russia is one of the few countries where the view of us has improved, right?
It's gone up. It's gone up.
4 points. We're up 4 points to 41% approval in Russia. Margin of error.
Yeah.
No, I don't think that there's not cause and effect here. I mean, I just following up on that question and the question earlier. What you say matters, but what you do matters much more than what you say. And I don't think that public diplomacy is the problem. It certainly hasn't been the solution.
We take this gentleman down here in the front.
Thanks. My name is Roland Paul. I'm a lawyer. Listening to you, it seemed like there were 4 reasons that explain most of all of the results that you got up with, 2 of which you've addressed. One was the Israeli-Palestinian issue as it affects the Arab world. Number 2, which this gentleman spoke about, was weakness among the powerful. In other words, we look very weak in Iraq. But the other 2 that haven't been mentioned and maybe you've addressed, one is relative to Europe. I deduce they have a feeling of more irrelevance than they used to, and their reaction to the United States is generated by their own feeling that we haven't catered to their. We haven't avoided that feeling of irrelevance as we used to. But the more important one is opinion is what opinion makers make it to be. And Al Jazeera has an audience of 40 million people. Would you say that a lot of what you hear is because whatever Al Jazeera's and Al Arabiya put on, that's what they're going to vote for. That's what you're going to see. And it's also true in this country. I wonder.
Well, I mean, I don't think this reflects opinions about the United States in the Middle East. Reflects the impact of Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya. I mean, some scholars have shown that there's not much of a relationship between how people get their news in the Middle East and what their views are. Their views are more generally based. I don't know how to add to that.
I can say one thing here. Many Americans don't realize that the views of, say, the Saudi royal family toward Al Jazeera are more negative than the views of the Bush administration toward Al Jazeera. In fact, they tend to arrest people who give interviews to Al Jazeera. In many ways, Al Jazeera has been a force for freedom in the Middle East.
But just on the European thing, I think Mike is right. Recently, the Europeans have mattered on Iran. The Bush administration has gone out to quite large effort to bring support from France and Britain and Germany in, and I think basically what you're talking about there is two things: is the Iraq War and the environment, and those are the two issues. They're not fixable until there's a new president. And so I think a lot of the things we're going to throw out here now, and opinions and attitudes, they're going to change when we have a new president who may have to keep troops in Iraq but won't be blamed for starting the war over the objections of the rest of the world. Mm-hmm. Well, fair enough. And won't, I think, no matter who it is, take this same initial steps on global warming of throwing away the Kyoto Agreement and the way the Bush administration did.
I would only add, I don't think that, propaganda, anti-Semitic and anti-American propaganda in the Middle East determines these, ups and downs. But I think it does have a long-term effect. I mean, Egypt is, in their public media, is perhaps the main source of anti-Semitic and anti-American propaganda in the world. You would read their reports on the Sudan, which I did. You get translated reports, and talk about America trying to convert the country to Christianity and trying to steal the oil and other things. There's a deep strain of conspiracy theory in a lot of these medias that are broadly believed, and that relating to 9/11 and the role of Jews in the world and other things. And that eventually, over time, has an influence on public opinion. So I was always thought that America should be more forceful in confronting, essentially, the governments that sponsor these things, because they do it for a reason. I think they actually draw attention to foreign enemies to cover the fact to cover their own failures.
But Mike, I think that was always true. That was true in the 90s and the 80s. We had the same level of conspiracy in their media. And the polling results show that something's changed. And I suspect one of the things that will be done by the next president is, again, there's a perception that's not fixable, no matter how well the Secretary of State works, that this president didn't focus on Middle East peace process. Even if he did, and you can make all the arguments about all the secret effort he made on the telephone and working the phones and all that, there's a perception that he wasn't trying very hard. And I think in that area, there is a policy that has an effect, even if it fails, and that's trying to negotiate the Middle East peace, having the Secretary of State fly over there, seeing that as part of their job, even if they fail. It's the one area where you're allowed to fail, and everybody doesn't think you're weak because they know how hard it is. And that pervades all of those Arab attitudes, is the fact that didn't take place.
Let me just, we're coming up to 7 o'clock. Let me take two more questions. There have been several very patient people here. This gentleman over here, and then you've been pretty patient back there.
I certainly agree with Andy. I certainly agree with Andy that...
Who are you?
Don Wilson, retired, formerly of Time Incorporated. I agree with.
Heard of the joint?
Huh?
I've heard of the joint.
I know you do. That's why I told you. I certainly agree with Andy that our image and the view of the United States abroad is to a considerable, a major degree a result of our policy and our handling of our policy abroad. However, I thought he perhaps minimalized a little bit the role of the people who support that policy, whether it's USIA or people down in the State Department. And I do think that there have been, I think it's important what role the president, whoever he may be, gives to the information body that is putting out information about the United States of America. I think that was particularly true for a number of years. I'm not sure that the information people are given the role in the White House that they were maybe 10, 20, 30 years ago.
Okay. Does anybody have a comment to that? And yes, finally.
Thanks, Joe. I'm Pranay Gupte, and I do not work for The Economist. But judging by the readability and readership of your columns, I think America's doing fine. I've been living overseas now for the last year and a half or so. Someone said something about you wearing Osama T-shirts. Well, I see more T-shirts that bear the image of George Clooney and some bearing the image of Angelina Jolie. Why not focus instead on culture and promoting America as the engine of growth, economic growth around the world? And let politics be as it is. Not everyone is a terrorist, and let cultures be as they are. Thanks.
Well, let me just point out, one of the most interesting things about this survey is that people tend to love our movies and our high tech, but they don't like our ideas and customs. Now, what does that mean, Andy?
It means that there's backlash.
It's a good way of wrapping this all up.
Part of this, and I would say a relatively small part of it, but an important part nonetheless, is that there's backlash to the Americanization of the planet in the eyes of people all around the world. There's too much America, people tell us, in their countries, even though they embrace our pop culture, like and respect our technology. And this is an issue that one that we have to contend with. I'm going to give you a quick 20-second report on the second report in this series this year, which showed that people were happier all around the world than they were 5 years ago, particularly in the middle income and developing countries, because GDP has increased. And global trade has had a positive, to your point, global trade has a positive impact on how people see their lives. And I would recommend that you read the report that we issued in July, which didn't get nearly as much attention as the anti-Americanism report, about the ways in which a richer planet is a happier planet, and that's a consequence of trade.
Well, I'd like to thank the panel. You've all done a wonderful job, and especially Andy for coming back year after year with his reports. And I'm sure that even after George Bush isn't President of the United States, we're going to have problems in this regard. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Patrick.